There are seasons a man carries inside him, the way a river carries silt, not on the surface where it shows, but settled deep, in the quiet places where the current slows. I have lived long enough now to understand that most of what shapes a life arrives without announcement. No thunder, no sign posted at the crossroads. Just an ordinary morning that turns out, only in looking back, to have been the hinge everything else swung upon. The autumn of 1886 was that morning for me. I was 26 years old, and I had spent the better part of 4 years making another man's reputation. I had loaded his plate holders in the dark. I had measured his chemicals by feel and by smell when the lamp was too dangerous to light. I had carried his cameras through dust and rain, and the particular indignity of railroad depots at 3 in the morning, where no one looks at the man carrying the equipment. I had watched image after image emerge in the developing bath, the face of a canyon, the geometry of a new bridge, the long, patient grief of a prairie horizon, and I had watched another man's name go beneath each one in the published record. His name, never mine. I did not complain about that, or not much. A young man learning a craft understands that there are dues to be paid, and I paid them without audible protest, which I suppose is the only thing I can say now in my own defense. I was patient to a fault. I believed that competence, accumulated quietly over time, was a form of argument that would eventually prevail. What I did not account for was the particular morning when keeping silent would have made me something I could not continue to be. There was a photograph. There was a family. There were men on horses who did not want that photograph to exist. And when I was instructed to destroy the glass plate rather than let it see light, to drop it in the gravel and grind my boot across it as though the image had never formed, I found that I could not do it. I was dismissed before the sun was fully up. No wages owed, I was told. No reference. No character. The word passed along the rail line faster than I could walk. Don't hire him. Don't house him. Don't let him through the door. So I walked. I had what I had. A wooden camera box I had built myself from scrap lumber in a rail yard shed, a brass lens wrapped in a square of boiler cloth, and a notebook of formulas and exposure records I had copied out by candlelight over 4 years, in handwriting so small a man needed good light to read it. My own education, written in my own hand, taken from no one. The road I chose led south and west, into the desert, toward a newspaper office I had heard mentioned once and remembered because a man in my position remembers every open door. There are men who carry other men's reputations the way a mule carries a pack saddle, without credit, without complaint, with only the private knowledge that the load would not move without them. I was that kind of man for a long time, and I did not see it clearly until the morning I was turned out into the cold with my boots still unlaced. 4 years. 4 years of rising before the photographer woke, of building the fire under the chemical pans so the collodion would be the right temperature when he was ready to coat his plates. I learned to read weather the way a sailor reads water, which light would hold, which cloud carried trouble, how long a thin autumn sun would stay useful before it went flat against the hills. I learned to brace a camera stand on loose shale, to time an exposure by the feel of the air rather than by count, to anticipate the moment a subject's face settled into something true. None of that knowledge was taught to me in any formal way. It was gathered the way a man gathers firewood in the dark, by feel, by repetition, by paying attention when no one was watching. The photographer I worked for was not a cruel man. That is perhaps the saddest part of it. He was simply accustomed to taking what was convenient and calling it his own, the way a man reaches for bread at the table without considering the labor of the kitchen. My hands mixed the silver bath. My eye leveled the horizon. My judgment chose the moment. The name beneath the photograph was his, printed in clean type in newspapers from Denver to Sacramento, and the thought that any other arrangement might be possible did not appear to trouble him. I carried that without speaking of it for longer than I should have. A man in my position, young, unknown, possessing skills but not the standing to prove them, understands very quickly that patience is the only currency he has. So I kept records. Quietly, by lamplight, I copied formulas into a notebook. Exposure calculations, chemical ratios, notes on light and distance that I had worked out myself over hundreds of wasted plates. It was not theft. It was the documentation of my own thinking, set down so that it would not be lost when the arrangement eventually ended, as I always knew it must. The end came on account of a family standing in front of a fence line that had been broken open. The men who broke it were still there when we arrived, and the way they stood, the angles of their bodies, the deliberateness of the threat, told a story as plainly as any caption could. I set the plate. I made the exposure. I developed it myself that same evening, in the wagon, by red lantern light. And what I saw when the image came clear in the tray told me something I could not bring myself to erase. The road into the desert was dry and very long, and I had only just started walking it. The road was not much of a road. It had been cut by a survey crew some years before. I learned that later. And whoever made it had not intended it for regular travel. It wandered in the particular way that roads wander when they are following the logic of the land rather than any human destination, bending around rock formations, dropping into dry washes, climbing back out again in long diagonal switchbacks that cost a man twice the distance for half the progress. The autumn sun in that country sat lower than I was accustomed to, and it threw shadows at noon that made the red stone look like the walls of something ancient and indifferent. I found it beautiful, in the way that a thing can be beautiful and frightening at the same time. I carried 3 objects. I want to be precise about this, because those 3 objects were not simply luggage. They were the whole account of what I had learned and who I had become in 6 years of work that bore another man's name. The first was the camera box. I had built it myself from hardwood salvaged off a broken instrument crate during a winter when we were laid over in a Colorado freight town waiting on chemical supplies. It was not pretty. The joints were tighter than a factory piece would have managed because I had cut each one twice and fitted them by hand, but the wood was mismatched and the sliding panel for the plate holder moved with a slight resistance that required you to know it. I knew it perfectly. It weighed perhaps 9 pounds empty and sat against my back like something that belonged there. The second was the lens. Brass-barreled, a longer focal length than most would choose for survey work, wrapped in a square of dark wool cloth that I had folded and refolded so many times the creases were permanent. The glass was without flaw. I had cleaned it myself, every evening for years, and I could have told you the exact quality of light it gathered, at any aperture, in almost any condition, the way a good carpenter can tell you the character of a particular plane by the sound it makes against the grain. That lens was the clearest thing I owned, in every sense. The third was the notebook. It was an ordinary ledger book, the kind used for household accounts, and I had filled 2/3 of it over several years in a hand small enough to fit the margins. Chemical formulas, exposure records, notes on developer temperature and fixing times in different climates. Alongside those, observations of my own, things I had noticed about contrast, about what the eye forgives that the plate does not, about the difference between a photograph that documents and a photograph that tells the truth. No one had asked me to write any of it down. No one had known that I was doing it. Those 3 things together were my training, my tools, and my argument. The desert did not care about any of them, but I was walking anyway. The desert does not introduce itself. That is what I remember most clearly about those first days after the road gave out and the survey markers thinned and finally disappeared. There is no ceremony to it, no formal moment where the ordinary world steps back and something larger steps forward. It simply accumulates, 1 mile of red sand, then another, then a sky so wide and pale it seems to have forgotten the color blue entirely, until you look back and the last thing you recognized is already gone behind a fold of stone. November deepened the way cold deepens in open country, not dramatically but persistently, like interest compounding on a debt. The days were burning and white at their center and bitter at their edges, and the nights dropped so fast and so far that I learned to have my coat sorted before the last orange left the western cliffs. I had camped in rough country before, during survey work, but always with a crew and a wagon and a cook fire built by someone else. This was different. This was being genuinely alone in a place that had not arranged itself with any human comfort in mind. And yet it was not hostile. That is the word people reach for. Hostile, as if the desert intends something toward you. It does not. It is simply vast and patient and entirely uninterested in your particular story. The silence was so complete that I began to hear the small noises I ordinarily never noticed. The creak of the wooden camera box against my shoulder, my own breathing, the faint percussion of my boots on ground that shifted between sand and iron-hard clay with no announcement. Sounds I had made every day of my life, never once heard. I began to think of it as a dark room. The comparison arrived uninvited one morning when I was watching the light change on a far escarpment, the shadows drawing back from the red rock the way a print clears in the fixing bath. Slowly, then all at once, the image assembling itself out of nothing. A dark room is a sealed place, lightless by design, where things become visible only through patient chemistry and careful waiting. Nothing in it is hurried. The process does not care about your intentions, only about your execution. Done correctly, something true comes out the other side. The desert felt like that, vast and sealed and patient, and utterly without sentiment. It would not help me. It would not harm me out of any personal feeling. It simply held the light and the cold and the distance and whatever was buried in it, and it would reveal what it chose to reveal at its own pace, in its own time, to whoever had the patience to wait and the honesty to look without flinching. I was not certain, in those days, that I was either of those things, but I was walking, which seemed like the only way to find out. The fourth day was the quietest. The arroyo had widened through the morning until it was less a channel than a country unto itself. Broad red walls pulling back to either side, the floor smooth and pale as old bone, the sky above it a narrow corridor of blue that deepened toward noon. My boots had grown stiff from the cold of the previous nights, and I walked with a slight hitch in my gait that I did not bother to correct. There was no one to observe it. There was, as far as I could determine, no one within 20 miles of me in any direction. I had been following the arroyo floor because the survey road had dissolved 2 days prior into nothing more than a memory of wheel ruts, and the arroyo at least offered flat ground and the occasional shallow pool of water caught in a depression of rock. My notebook was tucked inside my coat, the lens was wrapped in cloth and nested in the camera box. I had rationed what little I carried with some care, and I was not yet desperate, only tired in the particular way that comes from sleeping badly on cold ground, several nights in succession. The long shadow appeared first. I saw it the way you sometimes see a thing in a nearly fixed print, a darkness gathering at the edge of the frame that the eye keeps dismissing as shadow or smear, before the brain assembles it into something with edges, something deliberate. It lay along the base of the northern cliff wall like a dropped sentence, too regular to be rockfall, too irregular to be anything constructed with intention. I stopped walking. I set down the camera box. I stood very still, the way you learn to stand in a dark room when something is happening in the tray that you do not yet understand. Then the wind shifted, and I heard it, the faint, hollow knock of wood against wood, a slow, unhurried percussion, and the softer sound beneath it, the loose flap of cloth in the canyon draft. I walked toward it. They came clear to me gradually, the way everything in that country came clear. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the details accruing until the whole thing stood revealed, and you wondered how you had not seen it sooner. Wagons. 4 of them, perhaps 5, arranged in a staggered line along the cliff face. A supply cart tipped on its side at the far end. One wheel still in the air at an angle that spoke of considerable force. A length of black cloth, darkroom cloth, I recognized it immediately, hanging from an open door and beating softly against the wagon side in the wind. The government survey caravan. I knew it, before I could have said how I knew it. I stood at the arroyo's edge and looked at the broken line of wagons and felt something settle in my chest, quiet and cold and very specific, like a plate sliding into its holder before the shutter opens. I did not go down immediately. That is the first thing I remember clearly about those minutes. The stillness in my own legs, the way I stood at the lip of that arroyo and simply looked, the way a man will stand at the edge of something he cannot yet name, but already knows is serious. The afternoon light was going sideways across the canyon walls, that particular amber of late autumn in the desert, and it laid itself across the wreckage with a kind of indifferent beauty that seemed wrong given what the wreckage was saying. I read it the way I had been trained, without intending to, without being able to stop myself. A scene is a scene. Light and shadow and composition do not change their nature simply because what they illuminate is troubling. I looked at the first wagon, the nearest one, and saw that its front axle had not broken. It had been dragged. The wheel ruts in the canyon floor showed it. They ran not in the direction of travel, but perpendicular to it, as if the wagon had been pulled sideways with some deliberate force and left where it stopped. A man does not drag a wagon sideways trying to navigate difficult terrain. A man drags a wagon sideways when he is arranging something. I went down the slope carefully, my boots finding the loose shale and the dry packed clay in turns. The closer I came, the more the scene gave up. The second wagon had lost both its side doors, not hinges broken by impact, but pins drawn. The doors removed cleanly and laid against the cliff face, as if someone had needed clear access to the interior. The third wagon had tipped, and I could see at a distance that its cargo had been pulled out before it fell, because the ground around it held none of the scatter that a falling load produces. Whatever had been inside had been removed first. The black cloth beat against the fourth wagon's side with that soft, patient sound I had followed down the canyon. It was hanging from a door latch, and when I reached up and pushed the door open, the smell came out of the dark interior, like something that had been waiting. Silver nitrate and cedar, and the particular dusty sweetness of old paper wrapping. I knew that smell better than I knew most human voices. It was a smell I had lived inside for years, but it was not what I saw inside the wagon that stopped me. It was what I saw on the ground 10 feet away. Crate timber, shattered, glass in thin, pale shards catching the low light. I crouched down and touched one piece, no larger than my thumbnail, and turned it over. The emulsion side was still visible, or had been. A boot heel had ground across it. Not one crate, not a dropped box, not a stumble in the dark. Crate after crate, laid out in a line, smashed one at a time. There is a particular kind of ruin that speaks, and a kind that stays silent. Dropped things scatter, spilled things spread. But what I was looking at did not scatter and did not spread. It had been arranged. I rose from my crouch and walked to the next crate remnant, 6 feet further along the arroyo floor. Same pattern. The sideboards had been struck from above. You could read the angle in the split grain, and then the base had gone down, and whatever glass survived the first blow had been attended to afterward. Deliberately attended to. The shards nearest each pile were larger. The ones farther out were smaller, and that backwards logic told me they had been swept outward from the center, not thrown there by impact. Someone had brought a broom, or the flat of a plank, and cleared the larger pieces away from the main breakage so they could see that the work was complete. I moved to a third pile, a fourth, each one the same careful execution, each one separated from the last by nearly identical intervals, as though the man doing this work had a method he had settled on before he started and saw no reason to vary it. I have known men who work that way. Methodical men, men who think in procedures. What it told me was this: whoever had come down into this arroyo had not been in a hurry. They had not panicked, had not grabbed and run. They had worked through the crates in sequence, and they had known which crates to work through. Plate boxes have a particular weight and a particular sound when you shake them. Any man who had spent time in a field studio would know it. These crates had been identified correctly, every one of them, and not one crate of chemical stock or paper supply had been touched. I checked. The chemical crates were still stacked against the first wagon's wheel, lids intact, undisturbed. They had come for the negatives specifically. They had found them and destroyed them, and then they had gone. The cold was settling lower now, coming off the cliff walls in slow waves, and the black cloth at the open door made its soft sound above me. I stood in the middle of that careful destruction and turned it over in my mind, the way you turn a stone to find what lives beneath it. If someone had taken the trouble to destroy the plates one by one, working through the boxes without haste, without leaving anything to chance, then they had been certain this was all of it. They had counted, they had satisfied themselves that the work was finished. But a man who is absolutely certain he has found everything tends not to look beneath the things that do not move. I pulled myself up into the fourth wagon's dark interior and stood there a moment, letting my eyes find what the low light would give me. The fourth wagon was the last in the line, set closest to the cliff wall, and it had suffered less than the others. One wheel dropped into a rut, the canvas cover split along the ridge seam, but the frame itself stood square. Inside, the low light came through the torn canvas in thin strips, and I stood still for a moment, the way you do in a new room, letting the shapes come to you. It was a working wagon, not a transport. I could tell that at once. The inside walls had been fitted with narrow shelving, each shelf lipped to hold bottles steady on rough ground. There were brackets for chemical trays, a small iron stove no bigger than a hat box fitted into one corner with its flue pipe still standing, and at the center of the floor, taking up nearly the full width of the wagon, a developing table. It was a serious piece of work, heavy oak planking, iron-bound at the corners, the legs themselves bolted through the floor with hardware you would not find in a field camp unless someone had built the wagon around that table with intention. The surface was stained the deep reddish-brown of silver nitrate, years soaked in, the kind of stain that does not come from one expedition, but from a decade of use. Everything else in the wagon had moved. The shelving brackets had been pulled loose. The bottle racks were empty, their contents presumably broken with the rest. The small stove had shifted on its mount. Even the canvas sacking on the walls had been torn back, which told me they had checked behind it. But the table had not moved. Not 1 inch. Not one bolt worked loose. In a wagon that had been thoroughly searched, because that is what I understood now, that the destruction was a kind of furious search as much as anything. The table sat exactly as it had been placed, square to the walls, level on its bolts, its legs untouched. I had spent years in dark rooms. I had built developing tables in the backs of converted freight cars, in the basements of hotels, in a tent staked down against Kansas wind. I knew what a developing table cost to build, and what it cost to move, and why a man who needed to hide something in a field wagon would choose, above all other things, the one piece of furniture heavy enough that no one would think to lift it. The bolts were 4 of them, countersunk into the floor planking at each leg. Whoever had searched this wagon had looked behind walls and into every cabinet and beneath every loose board, but they had looked at that table and seen only weight. They had seen a thing that did not move and concluded it had nothing to give. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the base of the nearest leg, feeling for the bolt head. The iron was cold, the rust on it was old, but it was not fused. The wrench I found in the supply cart outside was a heavy thing, made for wagon wheel hardware, not for cabinet work, and I remember thinking it was almost too large for the task, the kind of tool that invites a man to force rather than coax. I set it aside twice before I understood that patience was the only method the rust would respect. I worked the first bolt for what felt like a quarter of an hour. The desert wind had found a gap in the wagon's siding and moved against my neck in slow, cold intervals while I applied pressure, released it, applied it again, feeling for the moment the metal would decide to give rather than shear. A man learns that from years of field work, that iron corroded in place has a kind of pride, and the only way to beat it is to make it think it is your idea. When the first bolt turned, it did so grudgingly, a single half rotation at a time. The second was easier, the third easier still, the fourth I nearly stripped, and I stopped and breathed and reminded myself what was beneath that floor and went back to it with the care I would have given a glass plate. Then I lifted. The table was heavy, heavier than it had any right to be, and I understood, as I tilted it back on its far edge, that the iron lining of the compartment below had been set flush with the floor, and then the table built over it, not simply placed. Someone had done this work deliberately, had planned for weight and concealment together, had thought about this the way a watchmaker thinks about a case. Whoever he was, whatever had happened to him after he sealed this place shut, he had been careful. He had believed this would be found by the right person. I do not know why I thought of him in that moment as having believed such a thing. Perhaps I needed to think it. Perhaps it helped me. The compartment was no more than 3 inches deep and perhaps 2 feet square, lined in dark iron that had kept the moisture out. Inside it were the sealed plate boxes, 4 of them, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with cord, stacked as neatly as if they had been placed on a shelf. Beside them, a folded leather case held papers. I could see the edges of maps, the curl of written pages. I knelt on that wagon floor in the thin gray light and took the first plate box into my hands. Even now, decades removed, I can feel the exact weight of it, the specific density of glass and silver, and whatever it was that had been captured on those plates in the days before the caravan was stopped. My hands were not entirely steady. I will not pretend otherwise. A man does not open a thing like that the way he opens an ordinary box. I set the plate box down with the same care I would have given a sleeping thing, and reached instead for the leather case. The maps came first, survey sheets covered in careful notation, elevation marks and boundary lines, a grid of numbered stations that meant little to me without the key. I set them aside. Beneath them were the exposure logs, pages of them, each entry written in a cramped and economical hand. Plate number, Time of day, light condition, subject described in the fewest possible words. The handwriting was steady and professional. It was the handwriting of a man who had been doing this a long time and had learned not to waste ink on sentiment. I recognized something in it. I had kept similar records myself, in the margins of another man's notebook, for years. The final document was separate from the others, folded twice, tucked behind the logs as if it had been added quickly and without the deliberateness of the rest. I unfolded it and moved closer to the gap in the wagon's side wall, where the light came through. It was a personal account, not a log, sentences, not entries, the same small hand, but looser now, written, I thought, under different conditions than the careful expedition records. He began by describing the valley. He used the word extraordinary twice in the first paragraph, which told me something about the man because in a professional document, a word like that costs something. He wrote about the light in the late afternoon and the way it caught the coal seams in the exposed cliff face. He wrote about what they had found being larger than the government brief had anticipated, larger and more significant, he said, than anything the survey office had prepared them to document. He wrote that they had been careful. He wrote that they had been thorough. Then the tone changed. A single line. We are being followed since Cienega crossing. After that, the entries were dated by day only, no hour. They had altered their return route. They had hidden 2 crates of developed prints beneath a dry wash some miles east. He gave a landmark I did not recognize. They had kept the plates and the logs with them. He wrote that if the caravan was stopped, the plates would mean nothing to men who could not read the coded logs, and the logs would mean nothing to men who could not match them to the plates. It was, I understood, a system designed for exactly this outcome. Not for rescue, for recovery, by someone who came after. The last entry was dated 3 days before I had stood at the arroyo's rim and looked down at the wreckage below. The final sentence ended with a colon, as if he had been about to list something. What followed that colon was blank paper. I sat with that for a long moment. The wind moved the darkroom cloth outside. The light held. I set the account down on the developing table and did not move for a while. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting. The sun had crossed the arroyo's southern rim and now angled low against the red cliffs, throwing a broad, warm rectangle across the wagon's side wall. I noticed it the way a man notices something he has been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. That wall faced south. It was smooth planking, painted white once, mostly intact, and the light falling on it was clean and direct and still. I had worked in improvised conditions before, more often than I had ever worked in a proper studio, if I am honest. There is a kind of freedom in a bad situation that a well-appointed darkroom does not offer. You stop worrying about what you lack and start thinking about what is actually in front of you. What was in front of me was this: sealed plate boxes with intact negatives, a wall in direct afternoon light, the chemicals in my satchel, and a notebook full of procedures I had written down in the margins of other men's work and never been permitted to use as my own. I found a length of salvaged glass in the supply cart, cracked at one corner but usable, and 2 wooden frames bent back into shape with a tent stake and patience. I stretched a section of the black darkroom cloth as a makeshift shade on either side to control the exposure edges. I set my printing frame directly against the white wall, angled to catch the full fall of the light. It was not elegant. It was serviceable. That has always been enough. I worked slowly. That is the only way to work when you cannot afford a mistake. The first negative I chose was from the 3rd sealed box, selected because its exposure log notation suggested a wide frame, more subjects, more ground. I pressed the sensitized paper against the glass, closed the frame, and held it to the light for the count I had calculated from the sky's brightness and the chemical concentration. Then I turned it away and watched. The image came up the way they always do, as if the paper were reluctant, and then suddenly not. A shadow first, the dark mass of figures near a structure. Then the structure itself, a fence line, and beyond it the pale suggestion of open land. And then the figures resolved. Men on horseback, grouped with the particular ease of men who do not expect to be questioned. Behind them, barely visible at the frame's left edge, a low building with its near wall already blackened. I made myself look at it carefully before I looked away. I set it to fix and dry, and reached for the next negative. The light held another hour at least. I worked through the whole of it, each print emerging from the paper like a word spoken carefully into a long silence, each one a piece of something that had very nearly been made to disappear forever. The burning cabins came first. I had not known what order the expedition had assigned the plates, and I was working from the compartment's stacking sequence rather than any numbered index. The exposure logs used a cipher I had not yet fully puzzled out. But the first group of prints told their own story plainly enough, and the sequence they composed was not accidental. Someone had arranged those negatives with care, the way a man arranges evidence he intends to present before a judge. The cabins appeared in 3 separate frames. The first showed a structure already well alight, the roof line dissolving into a white column of smoke that the contact paper rendered as a dark, climbing mass. Riders were positioned in the middle ground, not fleeing, not alarmed, simply present, patient, as men are patient when they have arranged the thing themselves and are waiting only for it to finish. The second frame was closer. The same scene, or one nearly identical. A fence gate stood open in the foreground. Through it, 2 figures on horseback faced the camera with the comfortable certainty of men who do not believe they are being recorded. In the third frame, the cabin was gone, and the fence line stood alone against open ground, as if nothing had ever stood there, as if the land had always been empty. I fixed and dried those prints and set them flat against the wagon's side panel. Then came the boundary posts. I had heard the practice described once, quietly, by a land office clerk who had been drinking and who took it back the next morning. A post moved half a mile, sometimes less, enough to shift a survey line, enough to place a homestead's water source on the wrong side of the claim. The negatives showed 4 men working in open daylight with iron bars and a hand level, moving a cedar post, while a 5th man consulted what appeared to be a map. There was no concealment in their manner. Why would there be? No one was watching, or so they had believed. The officials came last. The prints took the longest to resolve, and I stood over them with the kind of stillness I had learned to maintain when a long exposure was running. The scene was a table, portable, folded out from a wagon by the look of it. On the table were stacked papers, thick and uniform as ledger pages. On one side of the table stood 2 men in town dress, their coats too fine for the open desert light. On the other side stood men I did not recognize but whose bearing said plainly what they were. Between them, visible in both frames with the unhurried clarity of a thing done in full confidence, was the passing of money. I finished the last print and stood in the fading light, with my hands still damp from the chemicals. The whole of it was there, every piece. A record so complete it could only have been made by someone who understood, even then, that records are what outlast the men who would rather they didn't. I began to count the prints. I counted carefully, the way he had taught me to count chemicals, not out of distrust, but out of the particular respect that accurate numbers command. 4 prints from each surviving negative. Some plates had yielded 3, where the chemicals had thinned toward the end. I set each set aside in sequence, the numbered slips I had cut from a flour sack tucked beneath the first print of every group. It was in the counting that I reached the plate I had not yet fully examined. I had moved through the boxes with a kind of purposeful efficiency, saving deliberation for the developing tray and speed for everything else. But this plate, when I drew it from its sleeve and held it at the angle that caught the last good light coming off the canyon wall, made me slow down in a way I had not slowed since I first lifted the developing table and found the compartment beneath. It was a wide frame. The composition was not careful. Whoever had made the exposure had done so quickly, from a distance, perhaps from the seat of a wagon or the far side of a fence line. The foreground was the fence itself, or what remained of it. Posts were down. The top rail had charred along its length, and 2 sections had collapsed entirely, and behind it, the smear of a burned structure was just visible at the edge of the frame. Not in focus, not the subject, but impossible to ignore. The subject was a woman. She did not know she was being photographed. That much was plain. Her attention was directed toward a group of men who stood at the left edge of the frame, and she was facing them in the way that a person faces something they have decided not to retreat from. Her posture was not aggressive. It was something quieter and more difficult to describe. The posture of someone who has decided that this ground, this particular ground, is the last ground, and that she will stand on it regardless of what is being said or done. She was not young, not old either, somewhere in the middle years that the frontier ages differently than the cities do. I held the plate at the light for a long time. There was nothing technically remarkable about the image. The focus was soft along the right edge. The exposure was slightly long. Her dress showed the faint blur of a breath, a shift of weight. The men around her were sharper. The plate had been made to document the men, I suspected. She had simply been present, and the camera had caught her with the same neutrality it catches everything. But that posture. I had spent years around photographs. I had developed enough of them to know that most people, when a camera finds them unaware, look diminished somehow, caught mid-gesture, off balance, smaller than themselves. This woman did not look diminished. I slid the plate back into its sleeve with care that surprised me. I did not yet know why. I set her aside, that plate I mean, and made myself return to the work. There is a discipline to methodical labor that I have always found steadying. When the mind wants to run ahead of itself, the hands can be trusted to slow it down. I had perhaps 40 usable negatives remaining after the sorting. Some were cracked along one edge but still printable across most of their surface. Some were faint, underexposed, perhaps made on a cloudy afternoon, or the collodion had not flowed evenly, but the majority were clear and dense and full of information that someone had very badly wanted buried under a developing table in a dry arroyo at the edge of the painted desert. I numbered them first. I had a grease pencil in my kit, the kind used for marking developing trays, and I worked slowly, scratching a small numeral onto the paper sleeve of each plate and a corresponding entry into my notebook. Plate number, approximate subject matter, condition, any technical notes. I had kept logs like this for years on behalf of another man. It felt different doing it for myself. Quieter, more serious somehow. When the numbering was finished, I had a record. If any single plate was lost or broken, I would know which one. If someone took the lot, the numbers would mean nothing to them. But to me, sitting with my notebook in my lap, they formed a complete accounting of what had been found and what had been preserved. Then I began the printing. I will not pretend it was elegant work. The contact printing frame I built from the wagon's dismantled door panel was crooked along one side and had to be weighted with a brass lens cap to hold the glass flat. The sensitized paper I had prepared in small batches, and each batch took roughly 12 minutes of flat afternoon light to print correctly. Longer as the sun moved and the canyon walls began throwing shade across the wagon. I worked in sequence, by number, moving steadily and without haste, and by the time the light failed I had 3 partial sets and 1 complete set rolled and wrapped in the black cloth I had taken from the damaged door of the first wagon. 3 sets, separate routes. That was what mattered. I had found 2 intact mail crates in the supply wagons, the kind with rope handles and a pine lid that latches from the outside with a simple hook. Ordinary objects, the kind that ride on stage coaches without attracting a second glance. Inside each, I packed a numbered set of prints, wrapped in oilcloth, cushioned with wadded survey paper. I addressed each crate in the most ordinary hand I could manage. A hand that looked like a clerk's, like a supply order, like nothing in particular. The 3rd set I kept loose, wrapped only in cloth, tucked into my pack where the camera box would sit on top of it. The original plates I would carry myself. That had never been in question. The plates were the last problem, and they were not a small one. I had packed the mail crates with care. I had addressed them in a forgettable hand and latched their lids and set them against the wagon wheel out of the direct sun. That work was done. What remained was the question of how a man carries 16 intact glass negatives across open desert country without a proper case, without padding designed for the purpose, without any of the cushioned partitions that a studio wagon carries as a matter of course. I sat with the sealed boxes in my lap for a long while and thought about it the way a man thinks about a river crossing, not with dread exactly, but with a serious and patient attention to the particulars. The boxes themselves were good. Whoever had packed them into that iron compartment had done it properly, each plate separated by a strip of felt, the box lid fitted tight, the whole thing wrapped once in oilskin before being sealed with a band of brown paper. The Caravan's photographer had been thorough. I was grateful to him in the way you are grateful to a stranger whose careful work reaches forward and protects you long after the 2 of you could ever meet. I had my camera box. It was a plain wooden thing, heavier than it looked, made from 2 kinds of wood that did not quite match because I had built it myself from salvaged pieces over 2 successive winters. The interior was divided, one side for the lens in its cloth wrapping, one side kept empty for plates when I was working in the field. I had never carried more than 4 at a time. Now I needed it to carry 16. I removed the lens and held it. Then I removed the notebook. I set both on the wagon's tailgate and looked at what remained. The empty interior of the camera box was not large enough on its own. I knew that before I began. What I did was this. I lined the bottom with a folded square of the black darkroom cloth, then laid the sealed boxes in as flat and close as they would go, then built up the sides with wadded survey paper until the fit was snug rather than loose. The lens went back in wrapped twice over and wedged into the corner where it could not shift. The notebook went flat against the lid, held by a length of cord I cut from one of the supply wagon's lashing ropes. When I latched the box and lifted it, it was heavier than it had ever been. More than heavier, it was different in the hand. A tool had become something else. Those 3 objects I had carried out of my former life, the box, the lens, the notebook, were now in the company of evidence that a territory's worth of families had never been able to gather for themselves. I settled the strap across my shoulder and looked at the arroyo one last time. The first relay station was 3 days' walk from the arroyo, east along a cutbank road that had not seen regular traffic since the mail contracts shifted north. I knew it was still standing, only because it appeared on one of the survey maps, marked with a small square and the word which was reason enough for any man on foot in that country to take note of it. I arrived in the early morning, before the cold had fully lifted from the ground. A man of perhaps 60 lived there alone, running a few goats and accepting the occasional overnight traveler in exchange for a coin or a day's labor. He did not ask what I was carrying. Men who live on forgotten roads learn after a time not to ask. I told him I had mail crates bound for the territorial post and asked whether any wagon was heading east that week. He said one was due by afternoon, a freighter who ran dry goods to a settlement 2 days' ride on. I paid for a meal and waited. When the crate was loaded onto the freighter's wagon and covered under a tarpaulin alongside sacks of dried corn and coils of rope, I felt something in my chest ease that I had not known was tightened. It was not relief precisely. It was more like the sensation of having been holding one note on a breath for so long that releasing it felt almost violent. I watched the wagon roll out of sight around the cutbank, and then I picked up my camera box and walked on. The second station was 4 days beyond that, set in a dry wash between 2 red bluffs. A different crate went out from there on a mule-drawn post cart heading south toward a town whose name I recognized from a territory newspaper I had once read in a train depot waiting room. I did not linger at either place long enough to invite questions. That was the discipline of it. Ordinary crates, ordinary roads, ordinary traveler passing through. The plates I carried myself. I did not send those. Those remained in the box against my shoulder, heavier with each mile, not in the physical sense, but in some other way that I do not have a better word for. Between stations, I walked mostly in silence. The desert in late November has a quality of stillness that does not feel empty. It feels considered, as though the country itself is attending to something. I found I did not mind the solitude. It suited the work. The third station lay another 5 days east. I kept moving toward it, with the slow, even pace of a man who intends to arrive. The third station sent the last of the mail crates on its way the afternoon of the second day, and after that there was nothing left to dispatch but myself and the plates and the remaining miles. I will not pretend the final stretch was easy. My boots had begun to separate at the left sole by then, and I had taken to wrapping the foot each morning in strips of darkroom cloth, not elegant but sufficient. I had perhaps 40 cents remaining in my coat pocket, 1 biscuit wrapped in paper, and a growing awareness that the plates against my shoulder, for all their importance, could not be traded for a meal. The town appeared in the late afternoon of the 5th day past the third station, low adobe buildings the same color as the earth they stood on, a water tank on stilts at the far end of the main road, smoke rising from 2 or 3 chimneys in the still, cold air. Small, quiet, permanent-looking in the way that desert towns sometimes are, as though they had simply always been there and would continue to be. I found the inn near the southern end of the road, set slightly back from it behind a low adobe wall. A hand-lettered board hung above the door. I stood at the gate for a moment, aware of how I must have appeared, road-worn, thin, my coat carrying the dust of 3 weeks and the chemical smell of silver nitrate that never entirely leaves a man who has worked long with it. The woman who came to the door was perhaps late 30s, composed and watchful in the manner of someone who has learned to read a situation quickly and does not waste the reading. She looked at me the way a person looks at a question they are not yet certain how to answer. I told her I had some money, which was nearly true, and asked about a room. She said the rate. I told her what I had. There was a silence between us that was neither unkind nor encouraging. Then she asked, with no particular expression, whether I knew anything about dark rooms. I said that I did. She studied me a moment longer. There was a shed behind the inn, she explained, that had served as a small dark room for a photographer, who had boarded here 2 seasons prior and left without finishing the improvements he had promised. The roof leaked in one corner. A chemical shelf had buckled. The door no longer sealed properly against light. She could offer board and a cot in exchange for having it set right. I said that sounded like fair terms. She stepped back from the door to let me in. Her name I did not yet know. She had not offered it, and I had not asked. That is how things began between us, carefully, with a proper distance maintained on both sides, which seemed right to me after the weeks I had behind me. She showed me the shed the following morning. It stood perhaps 30 feet from the inn's back wall, built of the same pale adobe, low-roofed and practical. Inside, the air smelled of old silver nitrate and dry wood and the particular mineral sharpness that belongs to any room where chemistry has been attempted and then abandoned. I recognized that smell the way a man recognizes a voice from his past. The buckled shelf she had mentioned was worse than she had described. One bracket had pulled entirely free of the wall, leaving the whole surface tilting at an angle that would spill anything set upon it. The corner where the roof leaked had stained the floor in a slow brown wash. The door, when I tested it, let in a thin vertical blade of light along its lower edge. I did not tell her what I thought. I simply looked, and then went to work. There was lumber stacked behind the stable, left from some earlier repair. I asked if I might use what I needed, and she said yes, watching from the doorway with her arms folded and that same measuring expression she had shown me the evening before. I took only what was necessary. I measured twice before I cut. It is a habit from years of working with glass plates, where a careless fraction of an inch ruins the whole effort, and there is no undoing it. She came back in the afternoon to see what had been done. I do not think she expected much. The new bracket was set, the shelf leveled, the wall around it patched where the old fastening had torn through. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she asked about the door. I told her I would see to it next. By the third day I had the door rehung with a strip of felt tacked along the lower edge to seal the gap. The light blade was gone. I stood inside with the door closed and let my eyes adjust. The darkness was good, clean, the kind a photographer can trust. When I opened it again, she was standing a few feet back, not watching precisely, but close enough that she had seen. She did not say much, but the way she looked at the shed was different from how she had looked at it before. Something in her assessment had quietly shifted, like a door settling plumb in a new frame. There came a morning when I knew the shed was ready. Not perfect, it would never be perfect, out there in that dust and dry air with whatever materials I had managed to coax into use, but ready, the way a man who has done a thing many times over knows when the conditions are as good as they are going to be, and waiting longer will not improve them. I had one original plate I intended to use, the one I had decided would go to the newspaper editor in town, the clearest exposure among all those the Caravan had carried, the one where the light had caught everything it was meant to catch without equivocation. I developed it slowly and without hurry, the way my old notebook had taught me to work when the outcome mattered most. I had learned that lesson well, even if I had never been permitted to show it. When the print was fixed and washed and dried, I brought it inside. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee, the morning light coming in low and slant across the oilcloth, the way late-year light does when the sun has settled toward the south and does not climb as high as it once did. I spread the print flat and smoothed the edges down. She leaned forward to look. I started to explain what I meant to show the editor, the boundary posts, the riders, the official with his hand extended. She was listening, or appeared to be. Then she went very still. Not the stillness of someone who has stopped paying attention, the other kind, the kind that moves inward. Her eyes had found something I had not pointed to. Along the left margin of the frame, Where the expedition photographer had caught the edge of the scene, there was a fence line, posts and wire, or what had been posts and wire before the fire took it. And standing at its edge, caught at a three-quarter angle, unaware of the lens entirely, a woman, her back half turned, her posture entirely her own, unmistakable if you knew it. She did not speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was level, but something underneath it was not. She said she knew that fence line. She had built it herself the summer before, post by post. She knew the way it ran, the angle of the corner post where it turned toward the road. She would know it anywhere. She looked up at me then, not with the careful reserve she had shown most days, but with something more open and more raw. She said, "That is my land." What happened after that is something I have tried, in the years since, to describe accurately, and I have never quite managed it. Not because the events were complicated, they were not in the end, but because the thing that moved in those weeks moved the way a slow river moves, steadily, without fanfare, eating at the bank in ways you could not always see from the surface. The newspaper published the photographs across 2 full pages of its midwinter edition. I had sent the editor a letter of explanation before the prints arrived, and I had numbered each one and keyed each number to a brief description: date, location, what the image showed, and how it compared to the surveyor's coded log. Whether or not that mattered, I cannot say. What I know is that the editor, who had the look of a man who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of trouble to arrive on his doorstep, ran all of it. Every plate, 2 full pages. The mail crates reached town the same week, from 3 different directions, as I had planned. Each one contained a complete set of prints, numbered the same way, addressed to a different government office. The Land Commission in the capital received one set. The federal receiver in another district received another. The third crate, I was told later, arrived at a territorial marshal's office where it sat on a desk for 4 days before anyone opened it. And then someone did, and things began to move considerably faster. She read the newspaper at the table in the front room of the inn, the morning it came. She read it carefully, the way she read most things, thoroughly, without rushing, going back over a line when something required it. The photographs reproduced imperfectly in newsprint, as they always do, losing the finest gradations, but the images were still legible, still plain. What they showed was still undeniable. Other families in the valley received word through different channels. Some learned from neighbors who had seen the paper. Some received letters from the Land Commission, careful and formal and cautious in their language, but underneath the caution, carrying something that had not been there before, the possibility of reversal. The syndicates filed claims, she told me one evening, were being reviewed. That was the word used in official correspondence. Reviewed. It was a small word for what it contained. She said it quietly, turning the letter in her hands. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the cold had settled fully over the desert, and the stars were extraordinary, as they always were out there when the air was perfectly still. The ruling came in the middle of January, as I recall, on a morning so still and cold that the desert looked as though it had been carved from pale stone overnight. There was frost along the base of the adobe walls, not heavy, just a thin lace of it, the kind that disappears by mid-morning without ever quite admitting it was there. I had been awake early, as I usually was by then, tending the small iron stove in the darkroom, shed before the day's work began. I remember hearing the wagon before I saw it, the particular creak of a postal conveyance on the frozen ruts of the road, moving slowly, the way drivers move when they have grown accustomed to a route and feel no urgency about it. The letter was official. The seal on it was the kind you do not see often in small territory towns, and when she brought it to the table and read it, she did so without any particular expression on her face. I have thought about that many times since. She had trained herself over the years not to show anticipation where matters of the land were concerned, because anticipation had been disappointed before, and she was not a woman who allowed herself to be undone by it. But the language in that letter was not cautious, the way the earlier correspondence had been. This was plain. The forged claims had been voided. Her deed was confirmed. The valley was not empty, had never been empty, and the record now said so in terms that could not be easily walked back. She set the letter down on the table and looked out the window at the road for a long moment. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to me without a word, and we sat there in the early quiet while the frost dissolved from the window glass and the desert turned slowly from pale gray to the color of burnt honey. The syndicate's men were already gone. They had not waited to see how the reviewing concluded. They left behind the charred fence posts along the eastern boundary and a collapsed supply shed at the edge of the nearest homestead, and the particular silence that follows people who depart in a hurry and do not expect to return. The families who had been displaced began receiving their own letters in the days that followed, formal and confirming, and word passed along the valley the way news always passed out there, slowly at first, then all at once. She did not celebrate the way some people might have. She simply began making a list of what needed to be repaired. She made her list on the back of an envelope, and I watched her hand move across it in that particular unhurried way she had, as though the writing itself was a form of measuring, of deciding what the ground beneath her feet was truly worth. I did not offer to help. Some things a person needs to do alone, and the making of that list was one of them. The newspaper arrived 3 days later, folded inside a canvas wrapper and left by the stage driver on the porch post without ceremony. She brought it inside and set it on the table beside the coffee cups, and I was standing at the window mending a crack in the sash frame when she unfolded it and began to read. She did not say anything at first. Then she turned to the inside page, and I heard the paper flatten under her hand, and she read a line aloud. Not loudly, not as any kind of announcement, but quietly, the way you read something twice because you want to be certain it is there. Photograph by S. Reed. I have carried a great many things across a great deal of country. I carried a lens wrapped in a cloth that had been worn to softness. I carried a notebook filled with another man's methods written in my own hand. I carried years of work that bore someone else's name, and I carried the particular weight of a man who has learned not to expect acknowledgement and has made his peace with that, or believes he has. I did not know, until I heard those 4 words read aloud in that warm adobe room on a cold, bright January morning, how much I had still been carrying. She looked up at me over the page. She did not say anything further, and she did not need to. There is a kind of recognition that passes between 2 people without language, the way light passes through glass. It does not require the glass to do anything at all. I turned back to the window and went on with the mending. Outside, the desert lay still and pale under a winter sky that was the particular hard blue you only see in that country, a blue so clear it almost has a sound. The frost had not yet lifted from the lower ground. The road was empty. There was no reason that I could identify for either of us to be in any particular hurry. I have been asked in the years since, when I knew. I tell them it was that morning, the cold light, the newspaper, the sound of my own name spoken by someone who meant it. That was when